Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 13, coincidentally enough, of Monday Night Monsters. And before we get underway, of course, hi, Ron. How are you this evening?
I'm doing well, my friend. How are you doing?
Very, very good. It's not quite as hot as it was last week, thankfully. So I don't know if you guys are, hopefully, you're not too deep into the heat there. It's only in the 70s here, which I'm loving.
It's in the mid 70s, but I'll tell you, it's not supposed to hit 70 again for about 10 days, if you can believe it. It's supposed to be in the 60s, supposed to be, get a little bit of a cold break.
Believe it or not, I never mind that. I was born in January. I've got ice water in my veins, and I'm the guy who on the first day of summer can't wait till fall comes around. So for me, if it never gets above 70, I'll be just fine.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I just hope we can hear your little tree frogs croaking out there tonight.
I've got the window open, so I'm hoping the frogs will be back. I always love having them out there, although sometimes they do get a little bit on the distracting side. So we'll see how that goes tonight.
I think they're out there conjuring some magic, which is appropriate enough for our show tonight.
It is indeed. So yeah, we have a great show this evening. And folks, for those of you who may not have seen the announcement, so tonight we're going to be doing about a 90-minute show. We're running a little over on this evening's show just to give us some room to put in some good content here. And this is also going to serve as our season finale. Our 13th episode is going to be our big break before we go on our summer hiatus. Both Ron and I have big summers ahead of us with a whole lot of events going on. But please do not worry. We will be back in September. We've got a great show planned for our relaunch in September. And we are very much hoping that after all the cookouts and barbecues and fireworks and great things that happen this summer, that you folks will be back to see us again in the early fall. So I saw Pepper in there. Hi, Pepper and Jeff. Welcome back, guys. I didn't catch everybody who was in there, but welcome back and welcome aboard, everybody.
Yeah, I'm excited. I had a great time with you, Christopher. I couldn't ask to do this with anybody else. And it was always eye-opening and illuminating for me. And I learned so much from all of our broadcasts. And I learned just as much from the audience as well, too, who are some of the best in the business.
You folks out there, you dropped some amazing questions. You've had great suggestions and definitely taught us a thing or two. And Ron, you've certainly taught me some great stuff over this period. And these topics have been wonderful to explore. As I've mentioned many times before in previous weeks, I've really gotten an education over these last couple of months doing this and found out things that I never knew. Things about monsters, about folklore, ancient religions, and even plenty of stuff about computers because we've of course had our share of technical difficulties here. But this is my first ever live stream that I'm doing, and so I don't know if it's yours, but it's been a technical education as well, and so we're trying to get things smoothed out as we go.
Yeah, for me as well too. And at the end of the day, you learn so much about who we are as humans, and what is so great about this show, and it's a great bookend because last week was sharks, which are solely natural creatures. This week is about witches, which are completely human beings that we have now cast as the monster.
And actually, that's an amazing point and one that I wanted to address because this is going to be probably the most unique and different show we have done so far because the topic has a great deal of controversy behind it. Of course, there are modern witches alive today who are very real, very genuine people. And of all of the stories and all the monsters and folklore creatures that we've spoken about, witches are certainly not only the most human, but they are the ones who we'll have to talk about a body count. This is the topic of witchcraft, and the fear of witchcraft has led to the death of real live human beings, and that makes this a much edgier, much harder topic, and a much more sensitive topic as well. And I hope that we're going to be able to treat this today with sensitivity and with and with integrity, and really give you guys a good background on how witches came to become one of our most well known and one of our most frightening monsters, and how we managed possibly to vilify live human beings along the way. So.
Right, and that's a very good point, my friend. I know that we're not going to dwell too much on prehistory tonight, but if you look at the historical record from Egypt and Mesopotamia, the idea of the persecution of the witch or the other who was outside the boundaries of normal patriarchal society, this kind of vilification, this kind of persecution, is as old as we are as a civilization.
As a matter of fact, a subject that Ron had sent me some great material on a PowerPoint that he had did on the subject, and so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to one of our slides, which I think is appropriate right now, that I had not heard about, and this is the Maklu tablets, which is a really fascinating archaeological find dates back to about 700 BC, which is a collection of spells, incantations, and rituals which were designed specifically to ward off and thwart witches. And it's a fascinating subject that I read just a little bit about. I would imagine, Ron, at this point, you probably are a better authority on this than I am, but what a fascinating subject, and I did not know that this existed.
It's interesting because it's basically fighting magic against magic. So my question is, from a historical point of view, is what kind of magic are you fighting? If there is good magic out there and bad magic, and this is before any kind of Judeo-Christian influence within that area, although there will be an idea of right and wrong, of course. But what is actually going on there? What kind of talismans do you need whenever you are fighting against magic itself? And I think that that is whenever we get into the idea that these are spells cast by people who are outside of the patriarchal society. And that's something that we'll get into. This is going to be a great sociological perspective as well, too, because for the most part, magic was acceptable if it was in the hands of those who were responsible for such things, generally men who could read and write. However, whenever it was in the hands of women, that is whenever it became very scary, and that is because it usurped the patriarchal society at that time, and then women have then been cast as something to be avoided and something to be feared, which is with us to this day. So we're going back 3, 4, 5,000 years here whenever we see this slow development, slow evolution of the magic worker, of the woman who was, you would come to be a midwife or come to for medical advice or what have you. How this woman was so esteemed within society, and then 3, 4,000 years later, we were hanging her from a tree.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting because it just wasn't always like that. And by the way, I saw John chimed in. Hi, John. Very glad, as always, to have you aboard. And Mary, we've got you in here as well. But yeah, no, you go back a few thousand years before patriarchy, only before civilization really began to crystallize. And you had a very, very different world, a world where magic was a part of everyday life, but a world where magic was very primal. It was very visceral, and it was about the natural world around you, because these people didn't live in cities. They didn't live in places where they shut nature out from their world. These were people who lived hand in hand with nature. And while the nature of humankind is that we've always kind of risen above or tried to separate ourselves out from nature, there was a point in history where we understood that we were a part of that natural cycle. And one of the most interesting factors that's a huge part of early witchcraft is that early witchcraft was about the fusion of humankind with nature. It was about recognizing the communion and the connection that we had to nature and trying to manipulate it for our own well-being. And while that may sound on the surface as if it was a bad thing, the truth is that that's how all of us interact with the world all the time. We always try to interact with and manipulate the world for our best interests, and they did it magically in the beginning. And that led to there being magic that was tribal magic. There was magic that was men's magic. There was magic that was women's magic. A very first show we ever did, when we were talking about werewolves, shape-shifting, lycanthropy, and that kind of thing, was about a magical practice that was primarily focused in the early days on men, because it was hunting magic for the most part that led to the evolution of these shape-shifting myths. But the women's magic went in a different direction. Now this, sorry, pulling up another slide here. So early magic often attempted to influence natural forces to ensure successful hunts, fertility among the livestock. They didn't really have to usually worry too much about fertility among humans. People were having babies left and right, but fertility in the livestock was an important part of survival. And of course, good weather, not just good weather for hunting, but making sure that the winters weren't too harsh, that the summers weren't too hot. And so magic was directly influencing the natural world. But there came a point in history where they also began to recognize that you could celebrate nature. You could celebrate a good harvest or the coming of the summer, that first day when the first flowers were coming up through the snow. And so a lot of early magical rituals and some of the origins of religious practice came about as celebratory rituals that seasonally would come up, to appease or honor people, that the beings, the sort of natural beings that they believed controlled the fate of the world.
Yeah, the idea of the wheel of the year, that we are a part of this cyclical nature, that we are part of this. If you, it's very appropriate, because if you were in a society without any kind of street lights and you were dependent upon the world around you, the idea of what constellation shows itself when was very important, because that's whenever you knew when to start harvesting or start planting. You knew whenever wintertime was going to be coming. So without any kind of calendars, without any kind of way to, without any prognosticators on your news, you had to depend upon the natural world giving you clues about what was going to happen. And it was gathering this information from these clues that must have seemed like utter magic to the people that did not understand it.
Absolutely, and this is, of course, something that I think you pointed out in your paperwork that you sent me, is that this is in a lot of ways the rise of shamanism. The idea that there would be members of the tribe who were more observant, members of the tribe who, I mean, in any point in any civilization, there are people who are more astute and people who are less. But the ones who are more astute, more observant, had a better sense of the cycles of nature, would seem to have practically magical understandings of these things, and so these people would be able to notice that the birds were migrating a little early this year, or notice that the permafrost was lasting a little bit later in the season, and be able to make predictions based on that. And their powers must have seemed truly miraculous. And so to those people, you'd be likely not only to attribute some kind of magical power or even some kind of connection to the gods, but maybe authority as well. And so it wouldn't be unusual for a person like that to be given, a bigger vote at a tribal council, or even possibly a position of leadership. And so in those earliest of human civilizations, I believe that we considered magical ability, being a wizard, being a witch, being a holy person, to be something that was sacred and something that was given an honor.
Yeah, but magic is a loaded term nowadays. If you think about it, a child sees the world with nothing but eyes that see magic all around them. And if we were more in that kind of infantile state before all the technology, every natural thing that occurred around us must have seemed magical. A snowstorm or lightnings, all this kind of stuff had to be unbelievable and interesting and exciting for pre-scientific communities.
Of course, but at the same time, while everything around them was magical, there would have been individuals within the tribe, within the community, who had the ability to see ahead of what was going to happen. Those people could look at a thunderstorm and be wowed, and believe that gods were battling in the sky. But it would be the shaman or the holy person in the tribe who would be able to say that morning, when they looked on the horizon, we'll have a thunderstorm before evening, and that must have seemed much more magical. And again, a power that only a few people had, and that I think would have made them very special.
Right.
And there, by the way, and this is something I think we addressed quite a few episodes ago. It may have even been in the lycanthropy episode. Is that magic? Which became something that certain people could perform, was once part of everyone's life. I mean, there's always been times when everyone had their little charms, everyone had the little rituals that they performed. And to be honest, we all still do it today. If you ever knock on wood or throw salt over your shoulder, these are the little common magics that everyone had. But magic has always, especially natural magic, fallen into two pretty distinct categories. And these are things that became a big part of what would eventually become witchcraft. So you have the principle of magic, which is referred to as sympathetic magic. And sympathetic magic is the idea of sympathy, meaning a connection, that an object that is a part of something like hair or a bone or a claw would actually retain the power and retain the connection to whatever its source was. And so by wearing an amulet of a bear's claw, or putting on a pelt of a wolf, you could absorb some of the power of that creature, or in some way be connected to them. The other school of magic, and they're not mutually exclusive. Of course, they were often used in concert with one another, but the other would be imitative magic, where you actually act out the behavior or act out the result. And so one thing that was frequently done back then, when people were creating cave paintings and effigies of animals, is they would take spears and they would kill the effigy of the animal in attempt to ensure that that's the way that things unfolded. So if you killed the effigy of the bear, you felt that you were basically communicating to the universe, to the spirits, and to the great unknown, that when you went out, that was the event that you wanted to occur, and hopefully it would unfold that way. And these two schools of magic still exist to this day in both primitive communities that still have magical systems, and in a lot of the ways that even we in the modern world behave. I mean, we do so many things in order to encourage the universe to act in our favor, whether it's the little sayings that we have, whether it's, blowing on dice before you roll them on the table. We still actually perform so many of these things today.
Yeah, there are 50-year-old men out there that buy $200 football jerseys to wear for their favorite team, that kind of stuff. Right. Absolutely. Yeah, there's no chance you're ever going to play on the team, but you'll have to use that imitative magic because you'll wear that jersey, so you can imbue them with that kind of outcome that you're looking for.
Exactly. And the team that has the most spirit believes that their team will be the one that wins. And so it is funny. I think I often wonder if people realize in the sort of workaday world just how magical and superstitious we still are to this day, practicing these sort of very, very old, very ancient forms of magic instinctively without even being instructed to do so.
Right. And one of our programs too, and I think that we did get to it, but I think it was at the tail end and we had to kind of cut it off, about all of our baseball and football and all of our sports teams are named after animals, right? Or some sort of horse. Yeah.
And our cars and, so many things that we name after, the Jaguars and the Tigers and the Vikings and the Raiders and all these different things. Even when they're not an animal, they're usually named after some powerful warrior or some powerful thing in order, again, to imbue them with that ability. Blowing out birthday candles, Pepper, that is a great example as well. These are things that they seem silly on the surface, they seem meaningless, and yet we imbue them with so much power. And that's, I think, what gives them power, is just the fact that we're basically casting that energy out into the universe and hoping that it creates the outcome. And in some ways, who's to say it doesn't? Because when we are positively focused on things become much more likely to happen. And I think that although that's that's more pop psychology than real magic, I sometimes wonder if there's a difference.
Sure. And Pepper also said the great saying, "Red sky in the morning, sailors take warning." We all know that nowadays, but could you imagine 7,000 years ago, whenever the shaman gets up and kind of, straightens his back from the first thing waking up on the forest floor and says it's going to be a nice day or it's going to storm, and he already has that thought about what's going to happen, and it comes true. That has to be magical.
It absolutely does. Now, I think it's interesting that there had to be some point, some transitional point in human history. And again, we don't want to stay for the entire day on prehistory, but we're still kind of lurking in that neighborhood, that we began to look around ourselves and believe that somewhere in the, we in these tribal communities, we lived with our mothers and our fathers, our grandmothers and our grandfathers, and often respected our ancestors as well. There were many tribes that kept the bones or the dust of their ancestors, in special jars and honored them as well. And so there was a sense of that ancestral connection. But we must have wondered at some point where it all began, which was the first mother and which was the first father, the one that gave birth to everyone. And this was probably the very first perception or conception that we had of what would ultimately become the earliest human gods. And the earliest human gods were basically these primal ideas. They were concepts, the earth mother and the earth father. And this is also indicative of the fact that, as I think I mentioned earlier, that men's magic and women's magic began by just by the acts of how they lived every day to take different paths. Now, we live in an interesting time in history where gender roles are really being challenged. And that's because today we aren't confined to these gender roles. People switch roles and switch, the way they operate their lives all the time. And so gender roles don't have to control us anymore. But there was a period when it wasn't easy to step outside a gender role, because a mother who was carrying a child could not realistically be out there hunting, couldn't realistically be out there foraging for food. For safety's sake and for the good of her potential unborn child, she'd likely be staying closer to the tribe, closer to the homestead. That allowed the men to go out and do the hunting. And this is a way that these gender roles would begin to divide. And we imbued our gods with that basic identity. So this earth mother was a nurturing mother. She was almost always frequently pictured as a pregnant or a fertile woman. The male god, and the female god was almost always plant-based. She was the god of the earth. She was the god of fertility, where the male god tended to be more animalistic. And they both had their earthy aspects, but the male god tended to be a horned god. He usually represented a prey animal or a predator animal, and sometimes a communion of both of those things, because we did tend to think that all of the world was part of one, not really separate thing, and everything flowed into one another. And these primal god forms are something that I think really became the very first religious practice.
Yeah, I think there's, without question, you have to consider that these nature religions were indeed the first religions, even though they probably did not have a dogma attached to them and no scripture. So, in the way we formalize religion, it wouldn't quite be considered that, but it would definitely be a proto religion whenever the world outside was, it gave and it took away from us, didn't it? I mean, the world is so chaotic that it can grow us crops, but it can also be, it cause droughts, it can cause floods. So the world was, in a way, sort of like a very ambivalent parent. They would reward sometimes, and sometimes they would punish you as well. So that was a way that you had to, you had to appease, you had to propitiate, you had to appropriate, all this kind of stuff that was going on in the world led up to the idea now of organized religion later down the road. But at this time, human beings had not quite made God in their own image yet. That was still a while off. But you see definitely this anthropomorphic style going on, but not quite the 100% thing that we see nowadays.
No, in fact, again, this is a point in history when we still considered ourselves to be a part and parcel with nature. We hadn't quite come to that point in civilization where we began to see ourselves as above nature, began to see ourselves apart from it, and that was the transitional point, I believe, when we began to think of animals and natural phenomena as something that was not just beneath us, but that was lower than us.
Mhm.
And that, I think, is probably one of the real points where we started to cross the threshold into what will be the fear of witchcraft that would grow later, because so much of it was about believing that anything animalistic, anything primal, tended to be dirty, tended to be lesser, and tended to be base. And this is how we would vilify people who practice magic going forward.
Right. Excellent point. And we've talked about this on numerous shows. So for those people that are just watching now and you want to go back, you have 13 episodes to watch to catch up by the time we come back in September. But I've said before as well, too, the moment that we as civilization started to build walls and live behind those walls, what was at the other side of those walls now became the other, the things to fear. That
Absolutely.
was where the things that go bump in the night lived. And that is where all this kind of stuff is coming from. And as you can see, we're kind of at that verge right here, whenever the nature religion is soon going to be fading away, because now we're going to have walls. And alas, we have separated ourselves from nature, kind of like once and for all, as a matter of fact.
And I think prior to this era, prior to agriculture, prior to walls and aqueducts and the things that made us apart, allowed us to set ourselves apart from civilization, we didn't tend to hold the rest of nature responsible for the badness that would happen to us. If a lion or a tiger slipped into our encampment and took a child or killed somebody, we would want to hunt the creature that did the deed, but we wouldn't want to eliminate the entire species. And that's the thing that I think changed a lot, is that we began to think that wildness was wrong, wildness is evil. And so we were able to vilify animals, and we do this all the time. Actually, our shark episode was a great example of that, where because sharks are predatory and because sharks can and occasionally do kill people, our response to them is wildly disproportionate. If one shark kills one person, we want to send out boats and kill every shark that we can find. And that's definitely a terrible imbalance in nature. And I think that this is something that was a loss for humanity, because I think once upon a time we felt that keeping the balance of nature was crucial. Keeping the balance of nature was one of the most primary aspects of being a part of this planet. But when we lost that ability to see it that way, when we started to think that we were above it all and shouldn't be subject to the rest of the rules that the world, the natural world, exists by, I think that division began to be destructive for us.
Beautifully said, Christopher. Could you show the slide again of the horn god and the Venus of Willendorf that you just
Yes,
had
of
on
course.
there? Yeah, so there we go. So now I do want to ask you a question. So the Venus of Willendorf was basically reviewed. A lot of papers were written during the Victorian period. Do you believe that this is in fact based upon a fertility figure, or do you think, as some historians are suggesting in a review of Puritan literature, that the Puritans were so hyper sensitive whenever it came to sex and fertility practices that everything they discovered was, in fact, a fertility figure? What is your take on that? Because this is one of those iconic moments in human history where art actually represents something. One of the very first pieces of figurative art ever found. What is your take on the Venus of Willendorf?
It's a very, very good question. And it's a tough one because the truth is that it is hard to know for sure. It's obviously intricately carved. It's something that's a beautiful piece of artwork that's a little more detailed than many of the figures that had been found from similar eras in history. And so the person who did this was not casually just whittling for fun. The person who created this is somebody who obviously had reverence for it. And I think that reverence is probably what tells us that if nothing else, it was an idealized image. Now, today, when we very much value people who are slim and muscular, because that's the 20th and like late 19th and early 20th century ideal of people, we think the idea of a person being corpulent, being heavy and round and what they call Rubenesque is a turnoff. But when people were choosing mates, they would look for things in the mate that seemed indicative of the gender, basically. And so a woman who had what they would frequently refer to as childbirthing hips, large hips, large breasts, which would be good for suckling children, these would have been attractive ideas. You would have believed that if you were going to partner with this woman, that she would be a good mother and that she would be providing, and her weight and her size would all communicate to you that she was well fed, that she was strong and powerful, as opposed to some skinny, pale creature that you wouldn't think was capable of bearing your children. For men, it would have been the same thing. A short and squat, barrel-chested man covered with hair would have evoked the manly ideal. Now, today, we often laugh at people who look like this, and because it's not the perfect ideal in this modern world. We'd have people who are, shaved until there's not a hair left on their body, and they're slim and they're tight, and it's a very, very different world. But I would tend to still lean towards the idea that it was probably a fertility figure, or at the very least, and this is going to sound really funny, but or at the very least, kind of like an early form of pornography in being something that was a sexualized and very, very idealized image. Because let's be honest, we love looking at the things we are attracted to. And so a passionate sculptor who created an image of the perfect woman that we would later interpret as a fertility symbol might have just been creating something that was the magical outcome he wanted to achieve.
Sure. I will tell you, I'm going to tell you and the listeners and see what they have to say about that. In the past 30 years, two other theories have come out. One of the theories is that the Venus of Willendorf was nothing more than a child's toy, like a doll. It seems a little bit too intricate for that, from my perspective. The second one, and this is a very intriguing theory, is that it was designed to show a young woman how to make that particular hairstyle.
Oh, interesting.
True story. Because there's no face on it. It's just the hair.
I don't know. I mean, I think that's a fascinating theory. It seems as though an anatomically correct, and such an intricate doll would be, if it was nothing more than a way to show that unique hairstyle, it would seem like overkill, especially, for an era in prehistory when leisure time was hardly something that people had a lot of. So I have to say that I do find that one a little questionable. The idea that it's a doll is less of a stretch, although still still, I don't know, I'm going to still lean in the direction because of its look, that it would be probably either fertility or some kind of just an idealization. And to the listener who just chimed in, that of course some men and some women still very much appreciate, larger men and plumper people. You're 100% right, and I don't mean to overgeneralize that all the population doesn't find certain people attractive, but rather that the ideal that is projected largely in the media, when you watch television shows, when you see magazines and television, we as a media and as a sort of a global whole project a certain image of what would be the ideal attractive person, and that has changed all throughout history. There was no just two versions of it. It wasn't just plump people and thin people. There have been so many different versions of what constitutes attractiveness. And you can find some fascinating articles that trace that throughout history. And you can certainly see it in classical art as well. And I think that every single person and every single body type, has the potential to be attractive. And mostly, I think the attractiveness comes from the way the person presents themselves, not from their body type. That would be a personal take on my part.
Absolutely. Can we go back one more time to the cauldron of the Ceronius figure right there?
Yes, of course.
All right, so yeah, I think this is such an interesting figure, and we kind of glossed over it. But I think that we should kind of point out a few things on there. Again, we have the horned god, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think that I am, I think that our word horny actually comes from the idea of the horned god. Do you know much about that, Christopher?
I have heard that theory, and
Yeah.
I don't know if it's 100% correct or not. I think sometimes these theories are very easy to accept because they sound very good on the surface. But when you realize that at the time that a creature like the horned god was a part of folklore, that the word would not have been horn; it would have been
Right.
in a different language. So I don't really know. I can't directly speak to that. I do think it sounds like a little bit of a modern, sort of a modern, explanation for that. It probably deserves at least a little bit more a more in-depth analysis.
Right.
I do
Yeah.
love the fact that this character, who is from, I think, the original version of this figure, comes from an ancient cauldron that was discovered in was it Ireland or Scotland, called the Gundestrop cauldron, if I remember
Right.
correctly,
Right.
that had all sorts of other figures on it as well. But this was a very, very striking figure of a very human-looking horned man with the ivy wrapped around the antlers and the ivy showing below. He's carrying a torque in one hand, which is the symbol of royalty, and in the other hand, a snake, which has long been considered a symbol of wisdom. And it's clearly a deity figure. It's not meant to be a devil or a demon of any kind, but obviously a figure that is honored. And again, these two are very, very distinctive early interpretations, I would say, of those primal gods. But I think that something that's worth mentioning is that the horned god, because now we are going to kind of make a little bit of a leap forward in history. So getting out of prehistory and into far along in civilization, patriarchy, male dominance became something that was almost universal. It was almost global at this point. And with male domination, the idea of female god forms fell out of favor. But the male god forms often still had animalistic features. You had a lot of the ancient Greek gods, which were all dominated by males. The female gods were all secondary. In almost every world religion, the female gods got either given short shrift or put in a lower tier, or sometimes eliminated altogether. But the animalistic principles of these gods was still something that was very, very common. And of course, in ancient Greek, you had, in Roman times, you had Faunus and Pan, both the horned gods these were fertility and celebratory gods. You had Faunus, who was a god of eroticism. Pan was the god of nature. You had Dionysus, who was another horned and goat-footed god, who was a god of and all of these animalistic gods. But these became the source of, I think, the fear in the later Christian world, and quickly were transformed into devilish figures as Christian culture began to spread throughout the world. I mean, Christian culture realistically only goes back a little over 2,000 years, but all of the religious forms that preceded it, the Judeo-Christian religions that had begun and the sort of monotheistic religions that evolved at that time, were already beginning to vilify or suppress nature as a part of religious tradition. Nature ended up becoming pushed down and becoming part of the base, the thing that you wanted to avoid or rise above.
Yeah, goats were always seen as very lascivious creatures, and the idea during, like as you said, the Judeo-Christian religion as it starts getting a foothold, the idea is that we have to suppress our passions. The idea that we are human beings, therefore we have reason. We are no longer part of the natural world, correct? We are set apart from it by the will of God. Therefore, we have to control our natural tendencies to be like animals, to procreate and breed. So, all of these things that have been taught to us since the very first time that we left the savannah of Africa is now being suppressed within us. And in order to do that most effectively, we took some of our most cherished figures and we made them into demons and the devil himself.
And of course it was a reasonably easy transition because the early Christian scriptures, the early Christian documents, or rather pre-Christian, I apologize, the pre-Christian documents, the early monotheistic and religions in the scriptures refer to man as having dominion over nature, and it suggests it's in the book of Genesis, of course, that nature was put there for man purposes. It was for his use and for his use only. It was basically your private larder. It was your private playground, and man was placed above it all. And so the idea that any animalistic tendency or animalistic aspect within a god would make a god seem or a magical figure seem dirty or unclean to us. And so it was very, very easy. And in the Middle Ages, this was something that became confused and jumbled as things like alchemical images of things like hermaphroditic figures, things that were never meant to be representations of any real belief, like Baphomet, which is this figure was frequently referred to as the devil, frequently referred to as a satanic image, but was none of those things. Baphomet was a character, again, that was meant to be a symbolic representation of principles of spirituality and principles of divinity all mashed up. It's hermaphroditic. It has both male and female features. It has animal features and human features, the wings of what I'm sure many people consider to be an angel. But these amalgam figures were meant to represent symbolic ideas, not meant to represent something that somebody worshipped or something that was supposed to exist in the real world. But looking at this mysterious, sort of multifaceted creature, it made it very easy for people in these burgeoning religions, including the newly formed Christian religions, to consider them to be evil, consider them to be the forces of darkness. And so transferring them into the classic red-horned devil was a very, very easy leap.
Yeah, and Jeff Hilton made a very good point here as well too. The idea of the word pagan as well, which does indeed mean country folk, the same root where we get heathen from, which means the heat.
Exactly.
Someone that lives out in the country. It's because in the cities this was predominantly Christian. There was no time for these kind of folk ways. But if you did go into the country and the less civilized places, people were still holding on to these folk ways. Absolutely,
Absolutely,
they were to give this up. And I'm sure that some of these things existed up into the 1700s, if not even into the current era. I think when we talked about our vampire episode, we can see in places in Romania that most certainly some of these folk beliefs are still holding on to this very day. And
absolutely.
Yeah, so yeah. But I do want to say, so it seems that people believed in so much in this idea of the world being in constant vibrational union. Okay, the idea that we should be in union with nature has always kind of been there. And I had a professor tell me whenever I was in graduate school that if you look at a Catholic church, you look at, especially the ones that were built in the Gothic period, you see all this kind of rib vaulting and everything. So whenever you walk into the church, it is almost as if you're walking into the woods, into a sacred garden or sacred wooded glen. And about all through the church as well, too, are these fountains of water, either for blessing yourself or baptismal fountains. So in a church itself, it does appear that there's still the trappings of that naturalistic world still implicit within the Catholic religion, because we simply didn't want to give that part up.
and it was almost impossible to drive it out of the people. And so one of
Sure.
the things that was very common, and this is an interesting topic because within the pagan, modern neo-pagan community, the people who still practice witchcraft and other pagan religions to this day, and there are many, many of them, there are interesting truths that we've forgotten, but there's also folklore that is manufactured to help to uphold or base the religion. So just like there is folklore about witches that is untrue, there's folklore from the witches that is untrue. And all of it together is we all try to create a narrative that supports our point of view. And so in the middle of all of that, if you mash it all up together, you often end up finding the closest thing to an objective truth. Sometimes it's hard to get to that, but the truth that we do know, and it's pretty well documented, is that as the Christian faith spread across the world, spread out from the Middle East and across Europe, first of all, exactly what you were saying, that in the cities, the nobles, these were the powerful people, and these were the people who were valuable to the church, because you wanted to convert the kings, you wanted to convert the nobles and the lords. Those were the people who had power, and those were the people who had money, and so they were your valuable targets. So you convert them to your faith, and you don't worry about the common folk. You don't worry about the pagans, the paganas, the country people, or the heathens, the people who live within the heaths and among the heather. You don't worry about them because they don't really matter. They're going to work in the fields no matter what you do. So the spread of the Christian faith to the people of the common folk, the nature people, it was a slow process. And by the time it got around to it, you didn't necessarily even have missionaries that were converting these people. You just had edicts coming from the Lord on high. And to get the people to stop worshiping these horned gods and these these corpulent goddess figures, to get people to stop practicing their annual festivals, was nearly impossible. So one of the easiest things to do was to just say, we've got a new tradition that we're going to introduce to your annual May festival, and we're going to put this new figure atop the maypole. Or at your annual Samhain festival, we would now call Halloween, that of course there are a lot of saints that have died, and of course their souls are on the other side. And so in addition to appeasing the ghosts and goblins that come out, we can worship the return of the saints the next day. So you take their religion and their traditions, and you slowly co-opt it, and you create something fresh out of it that slowly rolls them over into your way of thinking. And eventually, if it's a gentle enough process, which it wasn't always gentle, but if it is a gentle enough process, people just roll right into it and they adapt to it. And so, of course, why wouldn't you make a church look like vaulted, trees rising into the, sky, have painted skies up there so it looks like you're in a grove of trees and fountains everywhere, because this is where people would have worshipped. So it was a perfect, it was a perfect rollover for them.
That's right. The whole idea of synchronization, that great term where the powers that be seek to synthesize the other kind of offshoot religions around you, so everybody can live in perpetual peace and unity. That was at least the goal.
Of course. So just because you and I have a tendency to just get really onward, I'm jumping into a couple of our slides to kind of
We have to.
Here. So one of the things, of course, that became fairly commonplace is that when people refused to give up their faith, when people refused to give up their traditions, their rituals, their little magical practices, eventually the religious leaders of the churches, which were beginning to pop up like mushrooms everywhere, eventually they started to have to try to put their foot down. And so slowly but surely, instead of just discouraging the practice, they had to start to make it illegal. And they had to start saying, listen, you're no longer allowed to do these things. You can't just say, we prefer that you don't do them, but now it has to be something that has a penalty. And sometimes those penalties were small. Sometimes, you would be fined for it, or sometimes you could be whipped for idolatry. But eventually, as the need or the fervor for these religions grew and grew and grew, the idea is that the penalties for them would become increasingly intense. And it was certainly true that the church, and I don't want to vilify the church, because the church is a natural extension of the way human culture works. It wasn't something that set out to do dark things, despite the fact that a lot of dark things happened at their behest. But eventually, your biggest tool is going to be fear. And the church did find out pretty soon that if you couldn't get people to obey you by promising them heaven, you could potentially get them to obey you by threatening hell. Hell was something that in some form or another existed in most religions, this dark underworld, this place where cursed or lost souls would go, and as I said, it was very, very easy to transform that horned pagan figure into the devil, and to tell the people that this thing they've been honoring all along is actually a force of evil, and that it's deceiving them, and it's going to drag them down into hell. Some people immediately said, well, now that you put it that way, of course I'm going to come to church and worship the right way. Other people resisted, and those people who resisted unfortunately ended up on the receiving end of some pretty severe punishments. And in the Middle Ages, this grew into a terrible, we are definitely jumping ahead here. As I've always said, folks, technically speaking, we're not the swiftest here, but it grew into a persecution that began to grow, and I think really out of control throughout the Middle Ages. And this would be the sort of the dawn of the witch hunts. And this was probably one of the darkest times in human history. There have been plenty of times that we've committed acts of genocide as human beings here, but the witch hunts lasted for literally 300 good years, or a good 300 years, I should say, not particularly good years, but a good 300 years, from the mid 1400s into the mid 1700s. And eventually, I believe, millions of people would come to a sticky end under the hands of witch hunters, heresy hunters, the Spanish Inquisition, and many others.
Yeah, I remember whenever I was in college, they were trying to pull those numbers back a little bit. People were saying about 100,000, but I had a professor that told me that they said that as much as we try to we try to reinterpret history so it doesn't seem as if we were so quick to punish those kind of people. But he said, make no mistake of it, at least 1 million people died in continental Europe due to the witch hunts. At least 1 million.
And the thing about it is that the campaign, the propaganda, the propaganda campaign against paganism and against heresy was pretty successful, because you needed just to slowly but surely convince people that anyone that was still holding out. Oh my goodness, big motorcycle going by.
Your frogs on motorcycles.
That these people weren't just simply your odd neighbors still practicing the old ways, but that they were a real danger to you. And so this campaign of fear became a very, very important part of how the persecution of witches would unfold. And one of the ways that they did this is by convincing people that witches communed with the dead, and that they would summon dark spirits. These dark spirits would return to prey upon you, and that the misfortune you may have suffered last season when your crops failed, or when your baby was born, stillborn, was actually caused by the malefication of these witches. And so being able to convince people that witches had power over the dead and the powers of life and death and could cause calamity and harm was an easy way to turn neighbor against neighbor and create this abiding fear of witchcraft, which in many ways still persists to this very day.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we talk about necromancy, this communication with the dead, you do have a slide here, I hope, on the famous biblical version of that, correct?
I don't believe I have a specific biblical slide. I do talk a little bit about King James,
yes.
but not.
Yes. Well, if we can remember the famous Witch of Endor was able to communicate. So this is a time in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament, whenever we actually see somebody to go into, beyond the community at large, to seek out a woman that was able to communicate with the dead. And in order for, she communicated with, I'm trying to get the name straight. She communicated with Solomon for Saul. Is that correct?
I believe so, but again, this is an area that I don't claim to be an absolute expert on.
Yeah. Well, let us just put it this way, that the Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they're all completely against the idea of seeking witches out for help of any kind, because witches at this time were predominantly women. But we do see a king of the Hebrews going out into the wild, into seeking out a woman, the famous witch of Endor, that was able to communicate with the dead for the purposes of knowing the outcome of a battle. So we do see
Yes,
that.
and so Ken had just thrown that up on there that it was Saul, some of the witch of Endor on behalf of Prophet Samuel, or
Samuel,
to communicate with the dead prophet Samuel to help him defeat the Philistine army. Which again, thank you, Ken. You're again, you're our man in the chair back there, and we love having.
Man in the chair. That's right. And when we had talked about this before, Christopher, this is such a broad. We could spend the whole time talking just on prehistory or just on the Bible, but I did want to put that in there to show that the idea of necromancy is extremely ancient. It just doesn't appear out of nowhere in the Middle Ages. This is with us, 3,000 years before that.
And Michelle, you're saying, so let me try that post again. Speaking in tongues was an evidence of Celtic witches, that they had reached across the veil and were speaking the language of the dead. This is a common belief, again, that witches possess this. And one of the interesting things about that, by the way, is that often the people themselves who were practicing witchcraft or practicing the old ways, remember that they were not completely apart from the world that they lived in. They too were a part of that world and had evolved with it. So often, and this is the part where things did get very confusing to identify what a witch truly was and whether witches were evil or not, is often the witches themselves would buy into some of the folklore and some of the propaganda. So a wise woman who had learned this from her, from her mother or from her grandmother, may say that she is communicating with the dead when she's prognosticating or predicting the weather, or using, a chicken foot dipped in blood, to create a spell, because they would learn from the people who went before, but the people who went before are no more immune to the propaganda either. And so witchcraft, in terms of being old pagan religion and folklore, this is one of the myths that is common within the pagan community, and that is very, very difficult to get around, is that there is this idea of this unbroken, perfect lineage of witchcraft and of tradition that dates back to prehistory. But the truth is that it can't work that way. Humans don't work that way. We do evolve. We adopt the culture that is around us, and so the magical systems that these people used were contaminated by the folklore that had come along with it. And so even something like using names like Lucifer or the devil to refer to a horned god may have been something that happened because these folks were learning it from an imperfect system. And so you had witches who were not necessarily evil people, even at this point in period in history, who were working positive magic and sometimes working revenge magic against somebody who had wronged them. So they were morally ambivalent and possibly even using the language of their own oppressors. And this made it very, very difficult to weed out the idea that these witches were evil, because we have this imagination, or this imaginary idea, that these witches were all perfectly innocent people who weren't doing anything wrong. But the truth is, in some cases, they were probably doing exactly what they were accused of, just because it was the part of the nature of the time and the nature of how people survived back then. And that makes it very, very difficult to really find the true core of morality in all of this, because while the witch hunters and the heresy seekers were certainly not doing God's work, they were committing acts that were ignorant and bigoted and evil. They often found easy targets when they found people practicing barbaric rituals that seemed to fit all of the possible, fit all of the template that they considered to be evil witchcraft, and that made it a very, very messy time.
You know what these witch hunters needed? They needed to get some sort of document together that kind of, categorized everything so they could all be on the same page whenever they go out on the witch hunts.
Like a tool, almost like a hammer against the witches.
A hammer against witches would be awesome.
I think in the old terms that would be called the Malleus Maleficarum, wouldn't it? The hammer of witches. Yep, a detailed manual written by, what was it, Kramer and Sprengler, I believe, were the original authors of this.
That's
it was
right.
An incredibly detailed manual of torture and execution and questioning used to root out heresy and witchcraft. And this was a document which I have to say is probably one of the most heinous crimes against humanity ever perpetrated by designated representatives of the Christian Church, because this literally was this was propaganda of the highest order. And one of the fascinating things about the witch trials at this period in history, one of the ideas is that you were directed to question witches and get a confession out of them, and you could kill them whether or not you got a confession. But there were different sort of statuses of the way you could execute a witch properly or improperly. But ultimately, your goal was, I guess, to get the points, as it were, from your higher up, of getting real confession, so that you could communicate this to the people. And the questions were impossible to answer correctly, because you never said to a woman, "Are you a witch?" You would say to a woman, by the way, and yes, this was almost exclusively against women. There were very few men that were accused of witchcraft. There were a few, but it was comparatively a small number. But you would never say to a woman, "Are you a witch?" You would say, "When you signed your contract with the devil, on what day was it and who was with you?" And you couldn't say, "But I'm not a witch," because that would result in a much more aggressive pain that you were inflicted. They would poke you with something, with a poker that had been in the fire. They would stretch your body more. They would continue to ask you these questions. The only way they would relieve the pain is when you answered the question they asked. And the only answers you could give to the questions they asked were some kind of an affirmative. So this document, I may say that there was some moral gray area in the pursuit of heresy, but this basically took the morality away. The morality was gone, and now this was an act of absolute evil being perpetrated against women by men who feared the power that women had. And this was a true change in the nature of the concept of witches and the persecution of witches, especially in medieval Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we showed another clip right before this with King James. And of course, that would lead the idea how much this inspired King James as well too is really incredible, because we think of King James and his Bible, but we also don't think of him as this paranormal investigator / witch hunter either.
Yeah, he wrote an entire book on demonology, and was fascinated, and also had a mortal fear of witches. I believe there's a story that he believed that a pair of witches had caused a storm, which was designed to sink the ship and kill him and his wife, and apparently developed both a mortal fear and a deep hatred of witches. And one of the interesting things about King James is that he was the first person to sponsor an English translation rather than the traditional Latin translation of the Bible, a translation of the Bible that could be read by any educated common European person. And so what's fascinating about this is a story that we don't know the absolute truth of, but that suggests, and there's a lot of reason to believe that there is truth to this, that thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, which is one of the great reasons, one of the great sort of justifiers for the torture of witches throughout Europe in this period, that was willingly or willfully mistranslated, because the original word in the King James Bible is pharmakia, which literally means poisoner. Now, the reason that there is sort of some wiggle room or some doubt in this story is the idea that while pharmakia does literally translate as poisoner, it's the idea that people still suggest that its connotation was always meant to be witches, as in herbalists and people who dealt with herbal medicine, and so that he wasn't mistranslating it, that it was simply, a loose translation of it. Other people suggest that he intentionally mistranslated it because he wanted to make sure that sorceresses, people who were practitioners of this old pagan magic, were persecuted. And it's hard to know. It's hard to know which one is the truth, but there are no parts of this story that make King James sound innocent in all of this, because he was the one who really opened the door to this widespread persecution. Now, the Inquisition was underway before this happened, but he made it, he basically justified it. And that, unfortunately, is a terrible choice.
Sure. Now, it is believed that this whole King James business with these witches up in Scotland actually inspired Shakespeare to write Macbeth. The idea
And
that
Shakespeare was writing at that time. That's true.
yes, that's right. And it's also been suggested that Shakespeare might have been helping write the King James Bible as well. So there's that connection.
Oh, that's interesting to think about.
Yeah.
I mean, now it's interesting because, of course, I mean, Shakespeare itself, people have often questioned whether Shakespeare himself even wrote his own plays. There's been a
Right,
lot of
right.
suggestion that even those were ghost written and that he was a little bit of a hack. But we're getting into a whole separate topic there
That's right.
that I
That's
am
right.
not academically prepared to investigate at this stage of the game.
Yeah.
What we do know is that the fervor for witch hunting after certainly an indeterminate but incredibly large number of people were brutally killed. That there were a lot of people who began to sour on this, and that this widespread killing that began to impact practically everyone. Even strange, sort of side effects of this. The Black Plague. One of the things that people have frequently said was almost the single-handed cause of the Black Plague spreading as far and wide as it did is that, in addition to the many, many women that were killed under the suspicion that they were witches, is that because of folklore, people assumed that cats were always the familiar of witches. People didn't trust cats. They didn't believe that they were holy creatures. They were soulless, and that cats being burned or wholesale killed alongside the witches, even burning witches atop a pyre with a basket of cats beneath them, are things that were done. But this elimination of a massive amount of the cat population throughout Europe allowed the rats to explode in population, and it were the rats that were spreading the Black Plague. So the execution of these witches, or the persecution of these witches, may have directly or indirectly created the Black Plague, which wiped out, what was it, a third of the
A third of
population?
Europe. Yep. That's
Yeah.
right. There was actually an edict that went out in London that stated that all cats and dogs be killed. So there was nothing to take care of the rats whatsoever. They were running rampant, but the thing is though, it's a double-edged sword, correct? Because you get rid of these things, but then you show that the witches are still at work because the devil was still, within the plague itself. So
Right.
but
You're basically trading on people's ignorance at that point, is
sure,
the fact that they still want a villain to their story. They want a villain to their story, and they're not going to be satisfied without that villain. So you're showing them that you're acting by committing all these atrocities, but you have to keep them under your thumb by keeping keeping them alive, and basically constantly manufacturing these new ways that the witches, whether it's from beyond the grave, which is certainly very common, that the spirits of the witches, or that the devil himself is bringing them back and doing this. So you always got to keep that villain alive and kicking. Now, it was very, very far along in the European witch hunts when here in the States we kind of got on the witch bandwagon. Of course, I think probably everybody here, and there are not many people who are not familiar with the fact that in Salem, the Puritans of Salem, who had very, very extremist religious views, which tended to be far more extreme than the people even in many of the surrounding areas, were driven by a massive hysteria to execute 19 women and one man, or was it 18
it was
women?
two men, James Proctor and Giles Corey.
Yes, and Giles Corey, who, of course, the only one of the group that was not hanged, Giles Corey, while all the other witches were hanged, they wanted to get a confession out of him, and they were bound and determined to get it. And so they placed a plank on his chest and piled rocks on top of it, and demanded that he answer their questions of who were members of the coven and all about his various witchy activities. And it's a wonderful story, and I hope that it's true, because it would suggest that the man was a true maverick. Is that every time they asked him the question, the only thing that he would say is add more rocks. And he died that way. And the last words he is alleged to have uttered was a curse on the sheriff, the constable of Salem. And they say, and this is kind of getting right into folklore here, but they say that the curse that Giles Corey placed on the town of Salem has followed the sheriff there ever since, and that practically every sheriff of Salem since the time of the witch trials has died a premature death of either a heart attack or blood disease or some other related condition as a result of the Corey curse. So a little bit of folklore to throw in there.
So much of it is from heart disease, and I think that's because they were pressing his chest, they were collapsing his chest. I think that's the reason that's going on there, my friend. But what I find so utterly shocking about Salem, I'm just going to make this real quick point. unlike places in Europe, whenever the Inquisition was coming into town, these were your own church mates. Do you know what I mean?
They
Like
were.
these are your friends, these are your neighbors that are so scared of you, and what they believe is that they're willing to crush you to death. It blows my mind. It blows my mind.
One of my very favorite lines ever in a film is actually from, it's not related directly to witchcraft, but from the Tim Burton film Sleepy Hollow. And in that film, the main character played by Johnny Depp says that evil wears many masks, none so insidious as the mask of virtue. And this is a fascinating truth that is followed the witch persecutions all throughout Europe and was certainly on display in Salem in 1692, is that the vindictiveness and the evil of the people of Salem, who quickly turned against their neighbors, would accuse their neighbors of witchcraft if it was going to save their own skin, including children, including in some cases their own husbands and wives, is truly, truly tragic. And the idea that these people who were so deeply, deeply religious at their core were the most vindictive and, and amoral people. It's a sad thing. And unfortunately, it is something that we see too often in humanity today. I'd love to say that as humans that we were always relying on our better angels, but frequently we are not.
Right. And we say this on every show. The most hideous and the most frightening of all the monsters is not the ones that creep around in their shadows. It's the ones that sit next to us in church.
Yeah. So in the wake of this era of witch hunting, when it did finally peter out, and here in America, our own witch trials here, which lasted only until the end of the 17th century and really did not carry forward very much into the 18th century. The 18th century was kind of the dawn of reason in many ways, although there are many people who would argue that it was not all that reasonable. At least these superstitions tended to die down. They took a backseat. People even still believed in witches, but there came a point where it was no longer a killing offense. In fact, often witches were just given a period of time in the stocks, or they were whipped or things like that. So the fervor for witch hunting finally did peter out. But our fear of witches never really did. And what fascinates me is that this is the era when the folk tales of witches really took off. And I'm talking about the folk tales that were not about your neighbors, but the folk tales that began to be part of our fiction. And so the fictionalization of witches and the monsterization of witches really, really took off. I think one of my favorite old stories is probably one that I think most people are familiar with, an old Russian folk tale, which is Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga is one of the most classic witches in all of folklore. And in the story, if you remember it, and I'm going to butcher it here because I haven't read the original story in so many years, but in the story of Baba Yaga, there's a young girl who's a sweet girl, and her mother passes away. So her father takes a new wife, but the new wife is very cruel and she's very vindictive and clearly hates the little girl. So one day while the father is off gathering wood, the stepmother says, I want you to go through the woods and see my sister, and I want you to bring her a basket of bread and a few other things. So the little girl knows that the stepmother is generally up to no good, but even still, she takes the little girl and she brings her. She takes the basket of the bread and she brings them to this old woman who lives in the wood in a hut standing on chicken legs. And as she does, she notices that there's a ratty old cat in the yard, and it talks to her and says, don't go in there, the witch will eat you. And there's a tree that tries to reach out and scratch her as she goes by. And all these different little strange things happen. But the goodness of the little girl is that even when she goes in and she speaks to the old witch, and she knows that the old witch is going to try to eat her and basically says, you're going to stay here, you're going to help me clean my hut, etc., that the little girl treats all of these little creatures, all of these mysterious things. She ties a ribbon on the tree because it's going to make it look beautiful. And so the tree becomes her friend. She gives the cat a piece of fish, and the fish now suddenly becomes her friend. So when Baba Yaga returns intending to eat the little girl, the cat tells her that if you do this, that you'll be able to avoid her sight. And the tree says, stand behind me, my branches will hide you. And all of the different creatures under Baba Yaga's control protect the little girl until she's able to escape and finally free herself from Baba Yaga. Now, as I know I didn't get every part of the story correct, but it's one of the wonderful old folktale. I think the first time I read it, I was probably 5 or 6 years old. And, but it's the first time I think that as an entertainment, as stories for children, we began to tell people that witches were out there and that that they wanted to eat you. And this became one of the most consistent parts of witchcraft folklore. And I don't exactly know why this is, although I do have my theories, that from this point forward, witches were now the eaters of children. And this is something that is carried through almost every bit of witchcraft folklore going forward since that time. Obviously, the Hansel and Gretel story, which is again all specifically about a witch who lures children to her house in order to eat them. So it is fascinating to think that this became the identity of the witch.
Right. So I have my theory. I'm interested to hear what your theory is. Just briefly, what is your theory on the eating of children? Where that derived from?
So in my opinion, I've always thought that this may connect to the fact that part of a lot of old pagan belief is the idea, and so this would be kind of a survival of this belief, is the idea that we are reincarnated, that we go on and live from life to life. Now, this is a very, very, maybe it's a cockamamie theory, but I've always thought that because that's still a big part of pagan belief, that wonder if some survival of this idea, the idea that you would constantly reborn and live a new life, might have been part of our unconscious, part of our idea that witches would survive not by being reincarnated in a new form and born in a new life over and over again, but would actually consume the life and become immortal, consuming the life of children. So it's a kind of a cockamamie theory, but I've always wondered if that had some influence on it.
Yeah, my theory is that by this time, witches and unfortunately Judaism have become so intertwined as
that is true.
The other Jews were often said to eat children as well too. We see this in 1398 in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. In the tale.
Keep talking. I'm going to shut the window. I'm afraid that the frogs are a little out of control at this point.
That's right. But we continually see this throughout the Middle Ages, where Jews are eating children as part of their Sabbaths, which of course would lend its name to witches' black Sabbaths and things of that nature. So I think that's what's going on. And of course, this all comes to a penultimate blow up in the 1930s and 1940s. So this is something that really was part of the European fascination and part of their culture. And Hitler just simply scaffolded off of that.
Yeah, he traded on the old fears.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
No, and you know what? Your theory makes a great deal of sense, and I think it is a lot more solid than mine. I won't deny that. I think that's a brilliant idea, and it is true because even dating back to the Middle Ages, when these witch persecutions had really, really started to take off, there was always a fear and a distrust of Jews. Always an idea that the Jewish holy books, the Kabbalah, and things like that they held forbidden magic. And so you're right, absolutely, this intertwining. And so I guess in this case, I suppose we'd have to wonder how that. How the Jews eating children maybe came about as well. But even still, the idea certainly being carried forth into the idea of witches makes a great deal of sense. But it does pop up again and again and again. I mean, I think it's interesting because when you see that either the consuming of children or the sacrificing of children is such a common theme, even in children's literature. I mean, again, this is a very, very common thing. Roald Dahl's famous story, The Witches, is about witches that while they do not directly consume children, they specifically set out. These witches all hate children, and their entire purpose for existence, practically all of their malefic magic, is about cursing children, cursing them to be trapped in paintings until they grow old and die, cursing them to turn into mice and things like that. Of course, probably one of the most popular Halloween films ever made has one of the darkest storylines imaginable. This would be Hocus Pocus, of course. It's a Disney film. It's a Disney film that I think everybody regards as fun and silly and lighthearted, which is truly strange if you imagine that the entire plot revolves around the fact that these witches want to kill every child in Salem and consume their life force to maintain their own youth. And even much darker horror films. Recent horror films like the brilliant Robert Eggers' brilliant film The Witch specifically starts out with witches kidnapping a child, and the disappearance of this child leads into most of the events of the film. But the idea of witches using children's life force in their magic is something that is a huge part of folklore. In fact, one of the most horrifying examples of this, and something that's very true in a lot of old folklore and still pops up in witch fiction, horror fiction all the time, is the idea that witches use the fat of unbaptized children in order to create their flying potions. And so they have to take children who are, basically newborn infants and catch them before they're baptized. It's horrifying to imagine that the imagination of these allegedly morally upstanding people turn to such grotesque and dark ideas in order to vilify people that in a lot of ways were a fear of people who didn't really exist. Because by this point, the fear of witches was based entirely on imaginary creatures. They weren't your neighbors who were, practicing folk magic anymore. They were mystical creatures who lived in the woods in lost cabins and ate your children for dinner. So,
right, but that's something that still sticks with us, right? I mean, it is truly, when we talk about the idea of Carl Jung and the idea of a collective unconscious, witches are indeed archetypes. They're seen in every culture. We know how they operate. Even a young child can identify a witch just simply by our representation, because it's been done so long. The idea of these witches' marks, or the color of their skin, or flying on a broom. But we have to also consider the idea that all of those things that we attribute to a witch, like riding on a broom or a cauldron, is nothing more than the subjugation of women. These are household things, and the idea that women, of course, are vilified and feared, really, I think, is an appropriate way to kind of lead the show at this point, because, as you said, men did indeed perish from these inquisitions and these witch trials, but predominantly it was aimed at women.
It really was. And by the way, Ken just came up with a really interesting fact. He had it on screen a second ago, that there in 2018, a couple years back, were 1.5 million practicing witches across the U.S., which means they were a little bit in excess of the 1.4 million Presbyterians, which is, I guess we're going to tick off a few people with that one, but that's just the way that the cauldron crumbles, as it were. No, it is true. And I've actually heard this said many times, and I do find it easy to believe that neo-paganism, that these eco-spiritual practices, of which modern witchcraft is certainly one of them, are one of the fastest growing religious trends in America, and maybe even across the world. And probably the reason for that is because we live in a world where now ecology is such a big part of the way we sort of see our interaction with the world, and because we have so many fears for the way, as a species, humankind is destroying the planet. And as always, folks, we're always going to go a little woke on here. That's just kind of the nature of the game. But so the idea of this ecocentric religion, and much of modern neo-paganism, which is where modern witchcraft rests, is about this eco-spirituality and these ideas of reconnecting with the forces of nature. In fact, I wanted to quickly address the fact that one of the most common things that people talk about when they refer to witches is people frequently refer witches as Satanists. In fact, in the original 2013 version of The Conjuring, and then I think it was just last year in 2021, the early 2021, The Conjuring 3, both featured as their main villains these witches who were specifically referred to as Satanists and were specifically out there trying to sacrifice people to the devil. And it's a shame, I think, in this day and age, that we are still portraying this idea. I mean, I understand there's a difference between folklore and between real life, and I love horror movies. Of course, I love monster movies. I found both of these movies immensely entertaining, but I would think that in a world where we do have a large population of people who practice such a maligned religion, that still communicating the idea that witches and Satanists are one and the same isn't necessarily responsible anymore. And there are other ways to do this kind of thing. And so a little bit, I'd like to say, a little bit shame on the Conjuring universe for continuing to perpetuate that idea. They certainly didn't come up with it. They're really just following the trend. But I do think that we could do better than that. I think we can certainly do better than that. It is true that there are real Satanists out there. I think it's interesting to note that, of course, the connection between witches and Satanists is virtually non-existent. Satanists utilize the Christian theological structure to create their religion. But the interesting thing about modern Satanism, and it's something that I think a lot of people do not understand, is that mostly modern Satanists are secularists. They don't believe in a literal devil. Satan to them is a symbolic idea of freedom against the oppression of the Christian church. And so this is something that, while, I don't have a lot of friends who are Satanists or anything like that, but the idea that Satanists are somehow inherently bad people isn't really a true thing. Most Satanists are pretty down to earth people, and the faith, it's protected by the United States Constitution as much as any other is. Wiccans do not have a Christian worldview. They use Wiccans, by the way, Wicca being the root word that would eventually be evolved into witch, and that's what most, I think, modern witches do refer to themselves as. Wiccans have a much older perspective and a much older religion. It's a little bit of what I would call a salad bar religion, which is that they have taken traditions and folklore from a lot of different eras in history and kind of rolled it up to create a reconstruction of this primitive faith, but even still a completely legitimate way to look at the world. And there is truly no connection between the two. In fact, even their most common symbol, which are frequently mistaken for one another, the pentagrams, the satanic pentagram. A pentagram is meant in the pagan religions to represent the four primary elements: air, earth, water, and fire. And then the upward point in paganism is representing spirit. It represents the idea of an outstretched human figure and the spirit in ascendance. Because Satanism tends to be a secular religion and believes that the mortal world, this physical realm, is the most important, they have this idea of the inverted figure where the spirit is at the bottom, because they don't really consider spirituality important. They're a very, very secular practice. And even those two ideas are sort of inherently completely the opposite of one another.
Yeah. Also, the pentagram, right? The pentagram is a good one. Pentacle is the wait. What are we talking? Wait.
So the pentacle would be the pentagram surrounded by a circle, which is actually used by both, but okay. The pentagram would just be the star itself.
Yes. Okay. So we have it in the Wiccan usage, and also I need to point out that this figure is also seen in many Catholic churches as well too. I was surprised to see it quite a few times, because it also represents all of nature in a balance as well too.
Correct.
Everything is kind of working together. So whenever you see the satanic one, everything is now chaos, right? It's thrown out of balance. Out of balance, at least the way I think certain people see the world. I mean, I respect the Satanist view. They don't believe that there is a supernatural, part of the universe. And so they have, in a sense, a somewhat atheistic perspective, but one that, because of so much time where certain groups have been oppressed by the dominant religions, they strike back against it by sort of uplifting the idea of this adversary. And it's an interesting perspective. It's not, it's an angry sort of a perspective on religion. It's not one that I would adopt, but I respect what they do. And I will say this for the modern Satanists, is they frequently are the ones who stand up for religious freedom and defend other groups when they're persecuted. So there is some merit to be given to them for that. So yeah, I think they're at least respectable, even if I don't necessarily agree with the way they conduct themselves. The last thing I wanted to do is just kind of address, because we have talked a little bit about modern paganism, and that there is a tremendous population out there in the world of modern people who are practicing neo-paganism. That could be Druidism, that could be Asatru, which is based on the Old Norse beliefs, and of course a tremendous number of Wiccans. And I'm going to do something which I have certainly not talked about online before, but I'm going to come out of the broom closet right here, and I'm going to tell you that I became a member of a coven back when I was 18 years old here in the state of Rhode Island, and we fought very, very hard to win tax exemption as a legitimate church recognized by the United States government, and we've won that fight. We became the first witches coven in the United States of America to actually win tax exemption. And to this day, while I am not a particularly devout Wiccan anymore, I still have an entirely pagan worldview, and very much associate with that perspective on the world. And what I do love about paganism is that paganism is about reconnecting with nature. It's focused on reestablishing the connection between humans and the natural world, which is lost, and it does very frequently put us at
odds with the traditional religions, which do tend to put mankind above nature. I think a little while ago, Ron, you mentioned something called the Wheel of the Year, which is the 8 cyclical holidays, which are celebrated by modern neo-pagans, specifically Wiccans, beginning with Yule, which is, of course, where we get the idea of the Yule log and the Yule tree for Christmas. Imbolc, the beginning of the spring season. You have the spring equinox. You have Beltane, the 1st of May, which is a wonderful fertility holiday. Then you have Mabon, which would be the basically the beginning of the summer season. You have Lunasa, the first harvest. The autumn equinox, and Samhain, which would be Halloween, which in many ways is considered to be the pagan New Year, the beginning and end of life, sort of our celebration of the moment where death transforms you into a new life. So there you go. Yes, I am proudly pagan and now out of the closet with it.
Yes. Now, the one point that I do want to make here before we wrap up this incredible show, and it was very enlightening to me, and I'm glad to see that we got such good feedback from the folks that are listening. But I'm a cradle Catholic, practicing Catholic, and if people think that the idea of worshiping a Judeo-Christian God is somehow in conflict with these kind of pagan outlooks, I would suggest anybody read the writings of Saint Francis of Assisi.
Yes, agreed.
Saw that. Yeah, so what has happened throughout the years is even our situation of major religions has changed and left the natural world behind because we've evolved out of that. We talked about. So we put up walls. Even religion puts up walls, and we no longer tend to see God in nature anymore. But during the Middle Ages, it was believed that God wrote 2 books. One was the Bible, and the other one was the Book of Nature. And if we could properly read the natural world, we could come to a closer spiritual walk with God himself. So I think that we are much more akin than we are enemies of any kind. I think that people need to think about these kind of things before they start casting stones.
I actually grew up Catholic myself, and I have to say that one of the things that I have always loved about the Catholic religion is how mystical and magical it is. We used to call it smells and bells because you had the incense and the robes and the chants and the bells and all these different things. And honestly, it was a wonderful transition into pagan witchcraft, where we often do many of the same things. And so for me, that was a great thing. But I did love what I thought of as the return to nature. I mean, I love that so many pagans on their altars will use herbs and flowers and things like that. They tend to be very, very naturalistic. Here you see a stylized version over here of the Willendorf Venus, done by a wonderful gentleman out of Ukiah, California, named Oberon Zell. And modern pagan altars are very naturalistic. They tend to have the flowers and the herbs. Of course, here you see an image of the goddess and the god, and surrounded by candlelight. We love the natural light. We love the candles. Now I'm, of course, deep in the we part of this all. And the other thing that I think is wonderful, and it is really nice to see in a lot of pagan religions, is that it is very common in a lot of modern monotheistic religions, especially spread throughout Christianity, is a fear of sensuality and a fear of sexuality. And one thing that is really wonderful about the pagan community is how sex positive they tend to be. It is a much less judgmental perspective, and I do love that very much. And it's something that is always nice to see. And so, yes, with that, folks, I do want to thank you all so much for staying aboard with us for this longer 90-minute season finale of Monday Night Monsters. Ron, thank you again for awesome exchange on all these wonderful concepts and ideas.
Hey, and you know what? We were on a show together with Ken a while back, and Ken thought it would be a good idea to match these two up. And even though I've not met you in person, you become a very, very dear friend of mine. And I'm really looking forward to September coming around till we can have Monday Night Monsters back on again.
Indeed, so am I. I mean, it's going to be a lovely and very, very busy summer, but I am also looking forward as well. And Ken, yes, it's entirely your fault. You're the one who created this Monday Night Monster. So guys, we do want to thank you so much, but please do not forget, we are not abandoning you. We will be back in September with our exciting show on Dracula, the absolute king of vampires. And I am so excited to open up fall by talking about one of my absolute favorite subjects. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we are going to peace out for the night. We want to always thank you for joining us. Please don't forget, if you've missed any of our shows, we've got them all up on YouTube on Dead Air Full Spectrum. If you liked this, like and subscribe. You'll be notified in September when we get ready to do our brand new season of Monday Night Monsters, right in time for Halloween season. And without further ado, folks, we will see you in the autumn.
See you, folks.